Good morning, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Sonia Hilgren. I am president of the Press Club and editor of Farm Journal. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN, listening on National Public Radio, or the Global Internet Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of upcoming speakers. On Monday, March 4th, Vice President Al Gore will present a speech entitled "The Role of the Federal Executive in Managing in a Balanced Budget World." Couldn't you give him some kind of more little PR tinge to that? On Tuesday, March 5th, Steve Case, the president of America Online, will talk about facing the challenges of the new global medium. And on Friday, March 8th, Senator Alan Simpson, Republican from Wyoming, will reflect on the state of Congress as he completes his final year in Congress. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of Press Club luncheons are available by calling 1-800-NPC-2334. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I will ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. From your right, Alexis Remendinger, Bureau of National Affairs. Greg McDonald, Houston Chronicle. Susan Garland, Business Week. Tom Rhodes, The Times of London. Carl Lubsdorff, Washington Bureau Chief, Dallas Morning News. Helen Thomas, Chief White House Correspondent, United Press International. Doug Harbrecht, Business Week, treasurer of the National Press Club and member of the Speakers Committee who arranged today's breakfast. Mario Recchio. How is it again? Recio. I had to ask her 2 times and I still can't get it. Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Bob Rankin, Knight Ridder Newspapers. Dinah Temple-Raston, Bloomberg Business News. And Wendell Goller, Associated Press Radio. In the world of presidential politics, our speaker this morning, White House Press Secretary Michael D. McCurry, is the campaign equivalent of the little engine that could. A few Americans have labored for more White House aspirants only to see them lose. In 1984, he took the job of spokesman for Ohio Senator John Glenn's failed presidential bid. In 1988, it was Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt's turn to have Mike at the microphone. When Babbitt failed, McCurry took the spokesman job for Democratic vice presidential candidate Lloyd Bentsen, as in Dukakis Benson. In 1992, Mike surveyed the stage of promising Democratic wannabes and, using his acute abilities to pick a winner, signed up with Nebraska Senator Bob Kerry's campaign. Poor Mike. But today, McCurry is living testament to the power of positive thinking. When Curry's campaign collapsed, Mike landed in Bill Clinton's brigade. And miracle of miracles, the McCurry curse was broken. Clinton won the White House. McCurry's work as a Clinton campaign strategist won him the job of State Department spokesman. And he did such an excellent job at Foggy Bottom that Clinton named him presidential spokesman in January 1995. A graduate of both Princeton and Georgetown universities with degrees in public and international affairs, Mike began his career on Capitol Hill, working for Senators Harrison Williams of New Jersey and Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York. Known for his affability, savvy, and sense of humor, McCurry has thrived in the hothouse on Pennsylvania Avenue. White House reporters regard him as a true rarity, a straight shooter who comes through for them day in and day out. As one veteran reporter puts it, it's hard to stay mad at him very long. Those who deal with him day to day also recognize his skills. His handling of White House communications during the Oklahoma City bombing episode and the toppling of Haiti's dictators will be studied by presidential scholars for years to come as textbook examples of getting out information in times of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, Please welcome to the National Press Club, White House Press Secretary Mike McCurry.
Gee, Sonia, thank you for that very, very nice introduction. You know, President Lyndon Johnson, when he got introduced effusively like that, he used to say, "I wish my mother and my father could have been here to hear that fine introduction. You know, my father, he would have enjoyed it, and my mother, she would have believed it." Look, it's a busy day at the White House. The President has got 30 of the nation's most famous media moguls there to talk about television programming and labeling for children. CNN has already announced that Wolf Blitzer, when he reports on the front lawn at the White House, will always be NC-17. Good news. But I'm here today to share some of my reflections of what it's like to be a White House press secretary. My principal observation to begin is that with children who are aged 5, 3, and 1, I can now attest that they are very well behaved in comparison to what I deal with daily. I want to start by saying that we all live in an extraordinary time. If we sometimes don't stop to think about such things, the Cold War is over. American values, American economics, our political forms are transcendent around the world, and we're about to elect a president who will guide us into the 21st century. Bill Clinton, who I, of course, will flack for a little bit today, he describes this as an age of possibility in which our progress towards realizing the opportunities that are out there depends on our ability to work together to meet the challenges that we face. Our ability to realize these possibilities depends on our capacity for finding common ground, he says, and for compromise, finding some common sense as well, as we deal with the profound changes that we confront both here and around the world. These changes, the ones that I think define the end of the 20th century, at the end of the superpower rivalry between democratic capitalism and totalitarian communism, and the adjustments that we all must make in the age of information as global technologies and instantaneous global communications create a new global interdependency. These changes are the ones that will define, I believe, the election ahead in 1996, so we may have something of a rarity this year, a presidential election that's really about something quite important. My brief talk before I take your questions, which is what I most enjoy doing anyhow, my talk will deal with the changes that have occurred in the realm of technologies of communication, what this age of information means as we look at the adversarial relationship between the press and politicians, and specifically between the White House and its boisterous and cantankerous press corps. My central thesis is that this very well-defined adversarial relationship is really much more affected by what we have in common than what we see as differences. My former boss, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, likes to observe that organizations that are in conflict become like one another. If you think of navies or football teams, new offenses arise, new defenses arise to mirror those new offenses. If you think of press and politicians, they live in separate professional worlds of politics and journalism, but they've got to come together to get business done. It's sort of like architects and plumbers. It takes creativity and imagination to design a house, but that doesn't mean much if you can't get water to come out of the faucets. It takes vision and persuasive arguments to guide a nation into a new century, but that doesn't mean much if you can't communicate your direction in the hourly, daily, nightly reports that this nation's increasingly diverse news media deliver to the American people. So two professions that must coexist, that must rely on the tools of this new information age. I've got a lot of experience, most of it losing experience in presidential campaigns, but I've seen how the changing tools of campaign politics has affected our ability to communicate. In 1984, when I worked for John Glenn, it was only the geek who was the delegate hunter who had a personal computer on his desk, and the rest of us were still zipping through self-correcting tapes on old IBM Selectrics. By 1988, when I worked for Bruce Babbitt, we had campaign offices in Phoenix, Des Moines, Manchester, and Washington linked by the indestructible Mac Plus. By 1992, laptops, cellular phones, satellite media tours were all the rage. and we witnessed the first filing of a campaign news report by a reporter using a cellular phone connected to a computer. And now in 1996, we've got campaigns on the internet. We've got reporters broadcasting live with their flyaways. We've got radio reporters giving accounts of the next event as they descend from 10,000 feet on the campaign plane. The technology of news reporting is changing dramatically the way we in the business of politics and governing deal with you in the news media. So what has been the impact of this technology on the press, on campaigns? What are the changes that we see as a result? I'll think of 7 and run through them quickly. First, there's been a compression of the news cycle, what we call the flow of news and information that goes out from Washington. We've entered a kind of an all the news all the time political culture. I arrive at the White House every morning at 7:30. There's Helen Thomas, radiant, ruby-eyed, waiting with her cup of coffee to get me to react and respond to the latest breaking development that's happened overnight. 2 of the 3 major commercial networks are getting ready to go to 24-hour news programming on cable. I told President Clinton the other day that in his second term, he's going to have 2 press secretaries, one for the daytime and one for the nighttime. The news cycle itself has accelerated. In the past, there was 1 big story a day. Then we went to kind of the AM lead and the PM lead. And now, hour by hour, White Houses and news media report the news and attempt to manage the news and the flow of information. Editors scream to match Wolf Blitzer's latest report on CNN, and candidates and White Houses set up rapid response efforts to respond to the news. My second observation, this truncates the news itself. Everything in this hyperventilated environment kind of becomes a headline service, short microbursts of information. Dole's running third in Arizona. Clinton reverses on Cuba sanctions. Klein, Grunwald, take your pick, author of Primary Colors. News organizations increasingly, as headline services, have to, give short pieces of information, and White Houses and campaigns try to figure out what that short information should be. What's the line of the day? What's the soundbite going to be? What's the headline of the story? Third, in this environment, analysis is replacing hard news as the principal feature of news reporting. This is a great irony, because as the news cycle accelerates and compresses the news, those who've got to work with longer timelines, the daily newspaper reporters, the magazine reporters, they're often forced to try to find some new product to sell. When a Washington Post editor says to a reporter, I already saw that on CNN, that's not news, what's the reporter going to do? Well, what often happens is the reporter attempts to put the news in context, to analyze the motives, the strategy, the thinking behind the announcements and the events. Before you've even heard a word about what the president said, you can wake up, read your morning paper, and find out why the president said it, what his advisors told him about the polls on the issue, how it's going to affect the election 10 months away. Fourth, the news media itself has changed as a result of this technology in the information age. There's been diversification and disaggregation. We all know, we've heard the term old media used, the big networks, the wire services, the major newspapers. They're now being challenged, they're challenged by what we often call the new media, cable outlets, talk radio, specialty publications, individual communications. There are thousands of journalists now who run thousands of directions to get their daily dose of news, and news organizations themselves are figuring out niches in the market. And we've got the Bloomberg now, which is this wonderful device used in the financial markets that tracks the business and economic news with a very fine reporter at the White House, several of them. We've got the Hotline, which is a daily dose of political news that's summarized in an electronic transmission that goes to all the junkies in Washington and feeds conventional wisdom. The old media itself is diversifying. The wires, AP, Reuters, UPI, they complain to me when I include the Wall Street Journal at one of our little briefings, but the Dow Jones Wire is important, transmits news. A briefing for a network news correspondent can go instantly onto the hourly radio feeds that they send out to their radio affiliates. Big newspapers increasingly offer wire service-like transmissions of their accounts, and the Associated Press now has a television service. So everybody is in the business of moving the news faster and faster. Fifth, the press corps itself is kind of becoming yuppified. Who can keep up with this onslaught of news and this technology? Well, the techno-literate. And my impression is that reporters themselves are becoming younger, that people earlier in their careers are getting much more prime assignments in the business of journalism. To see the old war horses of political journalism now, the Germans, the Broders, the Drews, the Oliphants, the Hunts, you've got to watch them on television because their columns don't get to you soon enough. They're all good reporters. They all distinguish themselves by covering the beats a lot more than they cover the airwaves. But I would suggest their understudies, their younger understudies, have a lot less experience, and they are more vulnerable to the whims of this technology and this rapid flow of information. Political reporters don't retire to the bar the way they used to or arrange some of the famous hijinks that you read about in Timothy Krause's legendary accounts of the boys on the bus. In fact, they don't even ride the bus. They fly commercial. They go to the health spa and they work out. They return to their hotel rooms and they rewrite for avaricious editors for the late edition. Just contrast some of the reporting of Michael Lewis in the New Republican campaign in 1996 with Hunter Thompson's accounts in Rolling Stone 24 years ago. Stephen Hess has written about this, about the cultural background of reporters, and he says, you know, they are upper income, they are Ivy League, they are culturally elite, they're often very privileged. In short, they're not a lot alike the rest of America. They are not, by the way, necessarily liberal. For the most part, they're about as politically androgynous as Dick Morris. Yesterday's frontline political reporters, the front page types, the working class state school backgrounds, more middle income, lower middle income backgrounds, many of them who started as sports reporters, which is one of the reasons why we have political coverage so rich with sports metaphors. They, in a sense, are giving way now to this new generation that is certainly literate and certainly informed by and shaped by the technology and the realities of the information age. Six, another outcome of this, another observation, the threshold for sensationalism is now lower, in part because of how technology impacts the business of news reporting. With the proliferation of all these news outlets, the less than savory can sometimes prosper. The tabloids that used to be the only ones that had the gossip and the salacious now have given way to Entertainment Tonight, to the supermarket sheets, to tabloid television, to talk radio. And respectable news organizations can gossip with the worst of them now because a breaking story doesn't automatically have the filter or the barrier of responsible editors or distinguished journalism school advisory board members who sit in control of what's being reported. I think in large part what we sometimes call the character issue is partly a response of the American people to a hunger for more information. Oh, there's so much out there, so much information. How do you sort things out? Well, you begin to look for who is like me, who shares my values, and what is this person really like. But I believe that there's also a little bit of a whiff of scandal in the way the reporting itself occurs. And there is an interest in sensationalism sometimes because the information can spread so quickly like wildfire through all the different uses of the technology that is available. Lastly, the separation between politics and governing is not the way it used to be. There used to be a real distinct culture of politics and campaigning versus the people who did the governing and who worked to really make the decisions of the nation. Campaigns have a very peculiar rhythm and riffs, and sometimes a lot of riffraff associated with them, but they used to be separate from the people who would actually run the government after the election. That distinction or that different culture is breaking down now, and it's all becoming merged together. It began to disappear when we had things like a Bill Casey becoming a CIA director, as a Jim Baker returned back to become a political strategist, as the gurus who were influential in the campaign became more associated with governing, as politicos became policymakers. So what should we make of all this change? What do the politicians need to do to deal with the realities of the information age? What do we think? There's some positive news here, I think. I think there's more information getting to the American people, and no democracy has ever suffered from having more information. There's also a growing preference for openness, for honesty, for accessibility among those in campaigns and government. because there's no sense hiding the truth if you know sooner or later it's going to be discovered, and the impact of this technology is to make sure that that is sooner. So campaigns now plan for more openness. In 1988, we planned to have reporters watch a Bruce Babbitt prepare for an upcoming debate to open up the doors of the campaign. Government officials themselves also now have to spend a lot more time contending with responses to the truth instead of finding ways to cover up the truth, because the truth will surely come out. Everything, in short, is an open book, or at least a fresh computer screen. On the other hand, all the technology, all the gizmos, the impressive ability to move electrons even faster does not change the human brain's capacity to think. The rush to analyze, to react, to respond, to pivot, to spin, creates an overwhelming rush to judge. And then there is rush, as in Limbaugh. Even before someone has facts, they're supposed to have opinions. And there are pundits aplenty to tell you what to think. The clutter of information that spews from all these different news sources, creating this zesty environment, also creates, I think, a dangerous temptation to stand out in the crowd. 535 members of Congress compete for headlines, and so the temptation arises to be outrageous, to thus be quotable. Reasoned, thoughtful, sober, profound arguments get lost in the hourly hurly-burly of breaking news. Need evidence for this? Think of two words: Dick Lugar. The flashy, the fleshy, that is now dominating our growing fascination with this breaking news, and this is a point that I believe James Fallows has made so very well in his new book. So how does a press secretary deal with this turmoil? How do you help the leader of the free world communicate? Here is my 10-point program for surviving this new age of information. Don't worry, in the era of government downsizing, there are really only 8 points. First, you have to always tell the truth. There has to be something grounded in this environment of all the information all the time, and the only currency of the realm at the White House that counts is accuracy. If you tell a lie, you're dead. If you know the truth and you fail to wink, you're dying. If you send the press away from and not towards the truth, you're going to go on life support. So long live the press secretary. Second, verify all your information. As Marlin Fitzwater writes in his book, the ability to verify and confirm the information that you use is the indispensable tool of the press secretary. Or as Margaret Tutwiler once told me, any day you walk out to brief and you don't feel butterflies in your stomach, turn around because there's something that you don't know. So collecting the information, dealing with the fast pace of information as it flows is exactly what a press secretary has to do, and the job is not unlike that of being a reporter. The only difference is I have unlimited access to the news sources and to the information, but you have to go find it, you have to confirm it, you have to always understand that not even the most senior aide, not even the president himself might have all the information necessary to guide reporters to the truth. Third, slow down. If I've tried to do one thing, it's to indoctrinate the press corps to the need to give policymakers time to think. The instant reaction is often the wrong reaction, not just politically, but factually. Last week, the press wanted me to comment on the anxiety, despair, anger, hostility in this nation that Pat Buchanan has touched with his pessimism. This week, I've been asked to comment on the resurgent spirit of optimism that Steve Forbes is tapping into with his message of hope, growth, and opportunity. So there's a good rule for incumbent presidents and press secretaries: don't comment on front-runners du jour. Fourth, underscore the information you use with human anecdotes. Americans like personal stories so that they can put some order into the crush of information and statistics and numbers and information that they receive. And a human story can be a compelling way to put facts in context. President Clinton often gives these wonderful speeches that sometimes get covered, but preceding them, he will very often sit down with a group of Americans, talk to them about their problems. The press corps hates this because they find them horribly boring, but when they are shown on cable or locally on local televisions, Americans really like it because they see an encounter that is real, and they see a president extracting real information from real people. Fifth, you have to always identify the source of information. And I think this is a responsibility of those of us who work in government. I found a little bit of common ground with the press corps on this, because I believe they, as a matter of journalistic propriety, believe that news sources should always be, to the degree they can, on the record when they're speaking, attaching their name to the information they're providing. I believe, as a matter of discipline and accuracy, it's better when the government uses briefers who are willing to brief on the record. I am told that we're doing some checking on this, that there, in 1995, were well over 265 different news briefings at the White House press room, and less than 10% of them were so-called backgrounders, where the news source was not identified by name. And I think that's good. I think we might even be able to do better than that. 6, we will have to be persistent if we're going to break through this clutter. So when the press corps gets bored at press secretaries and presidents who repeat themselves and repeat themselves and repeat themselves, understand that what we're doing is trying to make sure at least some small bit of what we're trying to argue gets through the clutter of information and gets to the American people, so that they can understand the argument that a president is making. And 7th, the adversarial relationship, which is the relationship between the press corps and the president, has always got to be an amicable relationship. If it can't, there are different worlds, there are different professional qualities that attach to the jobs that both of us must do, but we've got to do the job in an environment of courtesy and respect. I think every president since Thomas Jefferson has probably chafed at inaccuracies and innuendos in the press, but most presidents come to believe eventually, as Jefferson did, that our democracy is indispensable, the press corps is indispensable to our form of democracy. Edward Willis Scripps used to say that the press exists to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Most presidents have the pleasure of living in very comfortable circumstances, so affliction is necessarily a fact of life. Mayor LaGuardia used to say, there's no distinctly Democratic or Republican way to bust chops, so just bust them. Well, that's what the press corps does every day in a nonpartisan way. But the way that we will survive that testiness in the relationship is to make sure that there is always at least some mutual sense of respect. And lastly, before I get to your questions, the only way to survive this crush of information and the realities of this age is to remember that we are human beings and not machines. So to the degree to which we can use some humor, the degree to which we can have some personality, and the degree in which we can sometimes make each other laugh is, I think, the key to survival as we manage our way through what is a very difficult but a very fun relationship. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
As you know, our time-honored procedure here at the National Press Club is for people to send their questions up, and they send them up anonymously. But I think it is only fitting that I identify the source of the first question. You did say that you should always tell the truth, but Helen Thomas would like to know, would you ever lie to the American people, and have you ever lied to the American people?
Well, sometimes the art of being press secretary is the art of telling the truth slowly. You can't, I meant it when I said you can never knowingly lie or mislead the press corps. Any press secretary who does that terminates his or her usefulness to the president at that very moment. But there are times and ways in which press secretaries sometimes must manage the flow of news to give policymakers time to make the right decisions. And so we very often will have to kind of shuffle our feet and dodge and wink and nod and use all the techniques necessary to let reporters know something is going on that they ought to pay attention to, even when we can't be as forthcoming as we would like about the outcome. But Helen, I assure you that knowingly I never did tell an untruth, and I don't believe a press secretary, above all else, above all other members of an administration, the press secretary has to just flat out say that you cannot tell a lie. And if you're in a position where, even for reasons of protecting lives, you have to do that, you have to find the right way to communicate the truth in order to protect the nation's national security interests. That's the only circumstance in which that's even appropriate to think about.
Now, I know you told us something about the fact that you didn't want to respond to the question of the week regarding the Republican candidates, but nonetheless, the Republican presidential field is rapidly turning into a tattered crew of battered candidates who refuse to fade away. Tell us, Mike, in view of your past history of picking candidates, which candidate would you go to work for? But more seriously, could you assess the strengths and weaknesses of each of the president's potential rivals this fall?
Now, whatever happened to that guy Maury Taylor? He was looking real good. Is he still out there? I can't do it because I don't even know who's running now. They have so many out there. Look, the business of picking a nominee for the Republican Party is their business, and they don't need another pundit to go through the strengths and weaknesses. Everyone at this head table, one way or another, has written quality analysis exactly along those lines, so I will be smart enough to duck the question. Because there will be time as we think ahead. Think of how long it is until November. I mean, my gosh, people are saying, gosh, the president is a shoo-in. He's ahead in the polls. Well, all of this changes, and all of it is fungible, and it will not mean whatever is happening to these candidates as they seek the nomination today will define how they make the argument to the American people they wish to make as they go through the rest of the year. The president, for his part, is focused on making the argument that he thinks is important from his perspective about how we meet the challenges as we think ahead. And that's what's important. So I'll resist the temptation to answer the question.
Yeah, right. Now that you've bobbed and weaved through that one, who do you really think would be the toughest opponent for the president among the GOP candidates?
Look, you can't say. How do you know? How can you possibly know today how they will look, how they will make the argument, what the American people will judge to be their strengths and weaknesses after they go through the nasty business they're going through now of selecting a nominee? At about this time in 1980, remember, every single Democrat was just licking their chops at the idea they'd get to run against Ronald Reagan. Wouldn't that be a joy? And they were just dead wrong. So there's no way of answering that question now, nor should I, because it's really up to the Republican Party to decide that question themselves. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the candidates, and who would be the best candidate to run against the president? I'm gonna duck these.
You alluded to the fickleness of the press, talking about Buchanan's message, then Forbes's message. Should we take them seriously?
You mean the Republican candidates?
No, the press, one month or 1 week, it's this candidate, and the next candidate.
I remember that what journalists often have to do are produce snapshots of what's happening that day. You know, they have to take a picture and give it to you. But politics in a campaign is really more of a motion picture. And all of these things flow together, and what the press corps has to write and produce one day or 1 hour, or as I suggested, minute by minute, as accounts of what's happening in the campaign, are not the same thing as the story as it unfolds as you look back over time. Now, good journalists will do that. We'll read wonderful analyses as we go through this year, looking back over what's happened over a period of time. And I think you should take that very seriously. And I think by and large the press covers pretty well the daily flow of a campaign. But there's way too much focus in the coverage on the process, on the tit-for-tat exchange of charges and countercharges, and far less on those things that are much more meaningful over time as Americans sort out the information. Remember, I would suspect that most Americans aren't paying a lot of attention to this campaign right now unless it shows up in their backyard on a primary day, because they know, they've got good sense, they know that it's going to be way down the road sometime in the fall where they really will be asked to make some kind of choice. So I think if we all kind of cool down a little bit and think a little more about what over longer terms will be the real issues. Just one observation, because I do think this. You think about all this coverage of the economic populism message and whether it's resonating with the American people. Well, there's been a very thin slice of a Republican electorate in a few very small states that's spoken to that issue. Most of the American people haven't been engaged yet. And I think sometimes there's a temptation to make these sweeping judgments about the flow of history, to put all this information in context well before we have enough evidence to support the argument.
Well, to follow up on that point, 1992, President Clinton, economically anxious voters, I share your pain. This year, Buchanan is telling workers feeling the pinch of globalization that he will stand up for them in Washington by erecting trade barriers to unfair trade, foreign competition, and putting a moratorium on immigration. What's right and wrong with Buchanan's message?
Well, I'm not going to respond to his specific message, but I'll say this. There are 11 million Americans whose jobs depend upon exports. And one thing that President Clinton has focused a lot of his work in foreign policy on is expanding economic opportunities for Americans overseas. Just in 1995, I think we created about according to trade statistics just yesterday, about 500,000 new jobs that depend on exports. So erecting barriers or pulling up the drawbridge or saying that we can't compete in this world is a formula for putting a lot of Americans out of work, which doesn't make a lot of sense to President Clinton. And I think, again, all that I talked about today, the global flow of information and the globalization of commerce, requires us to be out to compete and not retreat. This president will remain fully committed to trade policies that expand opportunities for Americans overseas, because that's where history is going. We can't turn back and go the other direction.
When you first got the press secretary's job, there were a lot of complaints about the rude behavior of the children in the press office. Have you succeeded in getting a certain gravitas in the press office operation, or did you just bring in grown-ups?
Well, you grow up fast in the White House, and that is a very talented staff. I couldn't do the job of managing all of these questions and all of the information that comes through, the questions that arrive at the podium at the White House every day, unless you had a very capable staff. And from our deputies down to our press assistants who, help the press with their creature comfort concerns, I think they all understand that we serve a very important customer, the American people. It's the American people, after all, that need to get this information and know what's going on at the White House. And the way we do that is to serve the press corps that we work for, because we work for them as well as the president. We handle the needs that they have to get information, and we treat them like they're our employer, just as, of course, the president is our employer, because ultimately all of us are trying to serve the same audience, which is the American people. I think the people in the White House press office keep that in mind now, and they do a pretty darn good job.
Which of your predecessors as press secretary do you admire most?
Well, it's a good question, because I've learned from a lot of them. First, my immediate predecessor, Dee Dee Myers, who I think, in fairness, didn't have all the tools that she needed as she assumed the job as White House press secretary, but over time effectively made the case that you need to have the kind of access to information and what's going on in the White House to tell the story, to help the president's message go out. She won the right to have all of the necessary perks and entitlements that go with the office of press secretary, so when I took the job, I didn't have to myself fight for any of those things. And I think she broke a very important barrier by being the first female press secretary. Her predecessor in the Bush administration, Marlin Fitzwater, is someone I've gotten to know and I think very highly of, because he came out of the career of public information as a civil servant. He was someone who spent a lifetime and a career in helping the government communicate, and then became, in a sense, the nation's top public information officer by working at the White House. And I think he kept things in balance. Jody Powell, who served Jimmy Carter, has taught me the value of being the fly on the wall and watching all of the arguments unfold as you learn, the perspective that the president wants to have as you communicate decisions. And he was extraordinarily good. Those are the ones that come to mind. But everyone has to have a different style because, look, nobody cares what Mike McCurry thinks. No one cares what my opinions are because, of course, the only thing that really matters is what the president thinks and what the president decides. And every press secretary in that sense is going to be a reflection of the president who serves in the Oval Office.
Marlin Fitzwater was regarded as an affable sort. He had his favorites among reporters. Do you have your favorites? Are there some people you really like to get questions from, say, for instance, Sarah McLennan, who's in the audience today?
Well, she's a favorite, but I actually enjoy most of them. The ones I enjoy the most are the ones that will change the subject when you're in a little bit of hot water. So you can sort of say, oh, yeah, didn't you have a question on... No, so, but I find the chemistry pretty good. Now, there are a lot of my compatriots up here who could tell you what the working environment is like between the press corps and the press secretary, but on balance, I think you need to treat every reporter with respect. There are some that I frankly have to grit my teeth and just bear the question out, but that's part of the price of doing the job. But they all deserve respect. They're all there serving some portion of an audience that is important to the White House and important to the president because they are going to, one way or another, get their information out to the American people. So you got to treat them seriously, and you have to treat them all with respect. And by and large, I find that I enjoy working with them. That's a surprising admission, but it's actually kind of fun.
In what ways do you personally use a computer to do your job? Do you keep a PC notebook with you at all times? Do you have your own web page? Do you play computer games?
I'm getting the hang of it, but we use actually the computer system at the White House has been upgraded. There wasn't a lot. One thing I found when I started at the State Department in 1993, and I think it in part reflects the changes that I talked about. The Republican administration, after two Republican administrations, they came to office in the 1980s, and their way of doing business was very much defined by the technology of the 1980s. So both at the State Department and at the White House, we've discovered that we've really had to do a lot to upgrade the technology available. And our computers at the White House and the one that I use has got good email systems. I've got a brother and sister-in-law who live in Africa, and I communicate with them more now than I did over the last 20 years because of the internet. So it's part of the extraordinary change that's happening. But we use it in a variety of ways, especially on the road, to make sure that the links of information are always available.
How much access do you have to the president during working hours, and how much access during private time? Do you get to kick back and watch basketball games together?
No, I don't. His private time is so precious, and my private time is so precious to me that neither would I intrude on his or he intrude on mine. But during the day, you need to have the ability to walk into the Oval Office to check something when there's a breaking story. And I like, just as a habit, to, as often as I can, depending on the president's schedule, make sure before I go to brief the press corps every day that I have an opportunity to run my answers by him. Because after all, the tonal quality, the inflections, all the sort of ways that you communicate the news of the day ought to reflect exactly what the president thinks. So I try to see him in that capacity, in that setting, every day before our daily briefing. But by and large, if there's an important meeting, if there's an important decision that he has got to make, I try to be, as I say, the fly on the wall that watches things. Just one observation. It's not really directed that question, but it's sometimes you get asked, do you take part in the decision making, or are you there in all the meetings? And the answer is yes, but my view of the press secretary's role is the press secretary should not be a participant in the policy-making process around the White House, because, you know, your colleagues are going to say, as you go out and brief the press, well, you didn't do a particularly good job because, you know, you didn't like the way the decision came out. So I try to refrain as much as I can from offering up advice or counsel unless I really get cornered by our president, because I think the role of the press secretary ought to be one of neutrality in some of the back and forth and infighting that occurs in the White House.
How do you think the press secretary's demeanor and handling of the news affects the public's image of the president?
I don't know. Hopefully not much, because it's what the president's demeanor is and what the president's decisions that count. I think on those days when I get a little surly or testy, we probably don't do as good a job as we should of communicating. On those days when I have to take all the punches that come from the press corps and get our side of the story out, we probably do a little bit better. But that's all in the nature of being a human being, I think.
How do you balance the demands of your job with being the dad of 3 kids? And are you prepared to do it for another 4 years?
Well, this is a chance to talk about my wife and to say hello to Will, Marjorie, and Chris, who are out there in TV land somewhere watching. But it's only because of an extraordinary wife that you can do a job like this. And that kind of partnership, I think, defines so many of the working relationships that exist here in Washington now. But she has a marvelous capacity for enduring all of my time away from home. And what I try to do is just, you know, make it a rule that you stay away from the office if you don't really need to be there. And I don't feel a compelling need to be, you know, at the president's side every minute of every day in order to do the job that I do. So I think being able to spend time with your family and away from the Oval Office gives you a little more perspective as you try to do the job, which is, you know, maybe a good way to look at it.
Where do you stand on the CIA ever using journalists undercover? Is it ever justified? Doesn't it threaten credibility and security of every foreign correspondent?
It does, and that's why since 1977 our government has had a very clear policy: we don't do it. And what we've gotten all caught up in the last couple of days is the question of, is there a specific waiver or specific exemption that the Director of Central Intelligence has, so that in those exceedingly rare circumstances where there might be lives of Americans at stake, can you have some exception from the prohibition of ever using journalists as cover? And the answer, of course, is that it only under the most incredible circumstances should that even be considered, because the policy itself is very, very clear. You don't use journalists as cover, because then that jeopardizes the right of the free press to go around the world and gather information to find the truth. So that the answer is, we don't do it, and let's focus on the policy and not the very narrowly drawn exception.
Has the Clinton administration ruled out definitely a military response to Cuba's downing of 2 U.S. civilian aircraft? And will the government stop the anti-Castro group Brothers to the Rescue from flying into the area of the downings this weekend?
That will actually be today's hot topic at the White House daily news briefing, so you probably have to tune in there to get the answer. We are dealing in a variety of ways with responding to this very tragic incident, most importantly by toughening up the embargo that has been in place with support of both Democrats and Republicans to bring about democratic change in Cuba. With the group Brothers to the Rescue, we are working with them to both, one, protect their safety as American citizens, but 2, to acknowledge their right to travel in international waters and international airspace. And the White House will have more to say about how we are going to deal with events in coming days later on today.
Also today at the White House, industry executives from the 4 major television networks will announce plans to develop a rating system similar to the one in place for movies. This was at the president's urging, but the industry is angling for something in return: government allocation of channel space for the next generation of digital television. Should the government give this public asset away for free?
Well, we don't see necessarily a linkage between getting television and media and entertainment executives to do the right thing when it comes to protecting kids from television program that's not appropriate for them, and the question of how you are going to allocate the spectrum for auction. And we've already got the Clinton administration has a proposal for auctioning the analog spectrum, and that's well known, and our views had been previously announced on auctioning the digital spectrum, and that hasn't changed. A lot of that has been addressed in the context of understanding and implementing the Telecommunications Act that was recently passed. But the discussion today is on the question of how we get parents, how do we give parents more control over the type of programming their kids will see. And I think we're going to have a very productive meeting today because we've got a cooperative group of industry executives who understand that they've got some responsibility to address that question, and that Americans like the idea that they can have a little more control over the type of entertaining program their kids see, especially in the evening hours. So I don't think we didn't need to do much to convince them of the merit of addressing this very important question.
A poll among journalists taken last night at the National Press Foundation annual awards dinner indicated that a majority of the people at this dinner did not believe that there would be any White House indictments from the Whitewater investigations. Please comment.
I don't know. I mean, I certainly haven't seen anything that would suggest that, and based, as you know, on the President's and the First Lady's repeated assurances that they are cooperating and doing everything necessary to tell the truth, I can't imagine how there could be. But on the other hand, I'm not the special counsel, and that's in the province of the special counsel who's looking into those matters. So the truth is I don't know, and I would be as ignorant in answering the question as were the journalists who answered the poll last night.
Did you say journalists were ignorant?
Sometimes.
Well, at the same event, New York Times columnist William Safire, convinced that he really called the First Lady a congenial lawyer, not a congenital liar.
Oh, that's what he was trying to...
Well, there was some mix-up with transmission during the blizzard, he said. Has the First Lady forgiven the New York Times?
The New York Times is a large and multi-headed organization, and there's much to forgive and much to take pleasure in on a daily basis, which is one of the reasons why a great newspaper can sustain the type of reputation the New York Times has sustained for so long. Look, there are days when you just, you hate what you read, and days where you love to read more of the kind of press that you get. That's the nature of the business, and that I think forgiving and forgetting is not necessarily the nature of human beings, because you do remember when someone says something that's very painful and very ugly, and those kinds of scars don't go away. But that's one of the prices of being in public life, especially here in Washington, D.C. It's something, frankly, I wish a lot of us could do a lot about to make it a little less poisonous and sulfurous when we think about the climate that we deal with here in Washington.
Where in this era of tabloid journalism does the public's right to know end in terms of the private lives of elected officials and candidates? How far does the zone of privacy go?
Well, that's not a judgment that we in government or in politics can make for you in the news media. You've got to do that yourself, and you've got to do it consistent with the values of the customers that you serve. And they will tell you when they think something is outrageous, and they often do. They often tell you, stop giving us all this information we don't need about people's private lives, because we want to know what these people are going to do if we put them in office. Tell us what they're going to do. Don't tell us about all the junk. Tell us about the stuff we really need to know about. So you hear from your customers, and you make your own judgments then about what is important, because we can't set those boundaries for you. But I'd suggest that a lot of look, people do want to understand character, and they do want to understand what are the personal attributes that a person will bring to a job, but they want to understand those in the context of how it will affect the decision making and the policy making of the individual that we're talking about. And I think if we kind of keep that in the right perspective, we'll come out at the right place.
What is Hillary Clinton's real influence in the White House? Did she try to keep you from being press secretary?
I hope not. And given her reputation of getting things done, obviously not. So, so I don't, she is as, I was talking about my spouse earlier, and, I was thinking at that answer, you'd say many of the same things about Mrs. Clinton. She's an extraordinarily good mother. They just celebrated the 16th birthday of their daughter, and there have been some stories about her, more so than there have been. And by the way, the press has been, I think, done an extraordinary job of keeping her life private so she can grow up as normally as a kid can in those circumstances. And the President and the First Lady have on many occasions expressed their gratitude to the press corps for letting Chelsea Clinton be Chelsea Clinton. But she's a great mom. She's obviously a very valued partner to the President. She has extraordinary influence on him and shapes his thinking, just as my spouse shapes a lot of my thinking. But what the President and the First Lady concluded after the first 2 years of the administration is that having a sort of what we would call a line function assignment or a specific assignment in the White House is not the best role for her, that her counsel, her wisdom, 25 years of experience dealing with child welfare issues, among other things, are best brought into the mix at the White House in her capacity as a spouse, as counsel, as advisor. And she will be one great campaigner in the year ahead, and she is always going to be his first and most important asset.
Will you bring this point up? Will President Clinton ever formally declare for re-election? If so, when? Is there any reason to do that since he's already clearly running?
Well, so far we're kind of doing pretty good without having to get into this race. It is true, he is formally a candidate for re-election, so properly filed at the Federal Elections Commission. But the President has not been into this campaign, and I was thinking about this the other day. It's probably partly a psychological thing. There's not an opponent. We've got a Republican campaign underway now that is very fractured and very hard to read. I would trust the people up here who've been out on the campaign trail with the Republican candidates more to tell you what's going to happen in that race, because I surely can't. I don't think the President can either. But at some point, probably as we get into April or May, we will know who the Republican candidate is. We will know who's going to survive this very tortured process they have underway now. That's the point at which I think the President will mentally start thinking of himself as a candidate, because there will be an opponent that he's going to run against, and I suspect that's the point at which he will formally take the opportunity to say, my campaign is now beginning.
Steve Forbes has millions of dollars of his own fortune to spend in the campaign. Should he limit his spending to that of others, is there a risk the presidency is for sale?
Well, I'm just going to stick with my rule not to comment on the rabble on the other side of the fence. But there is an important principle at stake, it seems to me, which is our system of public financing of presidential campaigns. That was an important political reform. We need more political reform, not less political reform. And I'll leave it up to the analysts and the pundits to judge the question: is this somehow or other going to erode our confidence in the system we put in place in the 1970s to ensure the American people there would be more integrity in the presidential election process?
I would like to present to you a certificate of appreciation for coming here today.
Does this mean I passed?
You'd get it no matter what you said. And here is the Press Club mug for those early morning, 7:30 in the morning beginnings at the White House.
Well, since the American people have to endure this mug, I'm proud and happy to have this mug in my hand. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're not done yet.
Oh.
Would you please tell us, everybody is dying to know, I know people are getting tired of this topic, but nonetheless, we have to ask you, who wrote Primary Colors?
Well, the only thing I have no way of knowing, and of course my problem is the only books I get to read are Dr. Seuss, so I didn't get to read it anyhow. But I do know one thing for certain, which is we are all spending a lot too much time trying to think out the answer to that question.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you for coming, and I'd like to thank our staff members, Melissa Bender and Chad Taylor and Melanie Abdo-Dumont and Howard Rothman, for organizing today's luncheon. I mean breakfast. Gosh, pardon. Bye.
That's great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
This test never ends.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Joan Collins wrote primary.
Hi, how are you?
Joan Collins.